Exactly. We're always super fun at parties. Yeah. Keeping
Hey,
conversation light.
I think that's why we're friends. It's like that's how we met, right? We were the ones who could commute between talking about like capitalism and the crush of academia and like book publishing and then fun stuff like
Dogs.
dogs, magic and and just laughing. So
That's life. Life is all of these things.
exactly. So
Yeah,
at a party, I'd want to end up next to you anyway.
exactly. We're not afraid to go there.
No,
No.
no.
So we're going there today again.
Yes, yes. Let's get this started. I'm excited. Tell me.
So how did this come about? It came about by my periodic existential crises that I have, where I'm chugging along and going along my life, and then I have these moments of like, I'm exhausted. What am I doing? Does anybody care? Is anyone listening? Does this make a difference? Etc.
Right.
General existential issues. And
Yeah.
then, yeah, you said it does make a difference. And that helps to hear. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Um,
I imagine that a lot of folks would, register what you're saying and sort of find resonance in it, especially with the world we live in right now. But I think for you, there's also something like very concrete and material because you put out this podcast and there's a way in which like I always think about this because we're always having this conversation about what does it mean to be engaged in labor of producing knowledge, and particularly in the field of psychoanalysis so when you ask the question, so that's number one, that's one part of it. But then you ask the question, is anybody listening, and does it matter when you literally have a podcast that people listen to, right? So like that, it's an existential crisis, but then there's also like a concreteness to it, you
yeah,
know?
absolutely. No, and I hear from a lot of people that people love it, especially students. But I don't get a huge amount of direct feedback. So I'm not really sure what's going on. I feel like often like I'm kind of talking into a void and like, hopefully it helps. I always try to, platform people that I think are doing really interesting work, and I try to platform a lot of different points of views. And I really enjoy it. And I do think, I mean, especially with the current discussions going on in the more psychoanalytic institutions, I have realized since our conversation from my past breakdown existential crisis that this is a good space and it is needed. And yeah, I immediately end up like inviting more people that I want to platform on it. That's what I do.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm trying to figure out a way to be more interactive and to get more feedback and to like see who's out there and interact with people more. So I've been like working on the Patreon since we had this discussion. And like just yesterday, I started a Discord, Patreon, so that people can like talk to each other there and continue the conversation there. And hopefully that'll be the Discord. You can have like different topics. So like right now it's like books and different kinds of things, but hopefully maybe there could be like a psychoanalytic space on there where we could
Mm.
talk about things and have a better experience than we do, say, on these listservs.
That dreaded listservs, yes. Well, I think part of the reason why, when we were having this conversation and our conversations to those of you who are not part of these conversations are a mix of like dog photos and philosophical sort of inquiry and personal love and care and sharing parts of ourselves. But I think, this idea emerged to do this conversation because for me, Vanessa, part of what's really important about what you're doing with this podcast is that there's a way in which and I know I spent a lot of time thinking about this stuff, so bear with me here, is that there's a way in which part of what power structures or sort of oppressive power structures bank on is that these things happen to a big swath of us, right? Affecting us in different ways, but it happens and they become normative. The way that these things happen become normative fixtures, and then the the part that structures rely on is that, this happens a lot in psychoanalysis, I think, is that nobody talks about it, right? And nobody talks about it. And so the regularity or normativity of it just continues unchecked. And then we feel like atomized people sitting alone in our wondering and feeling more and more lonely in it, or feeling like there's something wrong with us, or that we don't have the capacity, or that we're failing at something. And so what your podcast has done regularly for me, when I listen, and I listen regularly, and I'm also a patron, by the way, so folks, come on, join in and give some love. But apart from that is that, like, you put words to the things that I think a lot of people are struggling with. Like, when people write me about your podcast or talk to me about your podcast, it's always like, I feel so heard, or I feel so seen, or I see myself in this, because it really takes up stuff that's happening and then like gives it words and a discourse. And the people you bring on also, I think, are accessible and put themselves out there and take that chance, right? Because when you talk about these things, there's also a worry or a concern about being disciplined in our field. But by and large, I think that's why I wanted us to do this, when I was like, hey, let's do this, because you also having to sort of worry about this by yourself, to me, is antithetical to the community of care that I'm always trying to think alongside you, Molly, Stephen, Amgi, and Mary, Carter, Leilani, like all our people, right? How do we like forge this community of care in a world that is constantly trying to make us feel like we don't have that community, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. And that sense of like alienation, like I remember texting you being like, maybe I'm too weird. Like maybe I'm too weird and my podcast is too weird, and yeah, people don't want to support it. But then yeah, you're like, well, you have a lot of listeners. And I'm like, yeah, like 1,000 people a day or 1,000 listens a day. So I guess it's not, or maybe weird is good. I don't know.
Yes, exactly. I probably said something like, I fucking love you because you're weird. Come on.
Yeah.
We don't
So
need more.
yeah, I'm just trying to figure out what to do to make it a more maybe communal space in that way, and like feel like there's a community of care, like you're saying.
Yeah. I do think also that the speaking about it is really important, because there's this way in which, at least the way that I sort of experience the world, that there's so many things that we are like have to keep up with, that I think sometimes also it might just be lost on us. And it's like it's like a regular discipline, a practice, I would say, rather than discipline. I like practice more, to remember that everything we quote unquote consume has labor behind it. Like, and this goes back to where we started, like, wow, we're really fun at parties, because here I am being like, I actually don't want to just listen to a podcast and take it in passively. I think because there are actual people doing labor, and it's not labor like, hey, like, we don't get paid to do this. That is part of the process of communal, right? Actively working in communal process to create knowledge together. But there is a way in which we are oriented in the world to just like passively take in stuff, or it becomes like an entitlement, right? Whereas like there's a lot of labor that you are putting in, labor you love, but it's still labor. And I think there's something to me about also naming that, is saying that this is actually active knowledge production, and people really benefit from it, and takes them somewhere else, and maybe they sort of take it in and they think about something else, or it adds to their practice, or adds to their clinical work, or they realize, oh, there's somebody like you out there that like really is into magic and psychoanalysis, and that's not a quote unquote weird thing. Right. So I also want to name that, because it's kind of awkward for you to be the one to say that, or maybe I'm assuming that it's awkward.
It's awkward. And I also don't want to, sometimes like I hear people and it's totally fine for people to do this, but they like start their podcast and like, my livelihood really depends on your support and things like that. And, I don't want to do that because number one, I'll be okay. Like I always say, I'll be okay. Like I'll manage either way, whether people, chip in or not. Um, and I'll probably still keep doing it because sometimes I'm a little masochistic.
And it's worth it to you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and this is just what I do. I just like doing these things. And I also I'm really passionate about psychoanalysis. And ever since I've been in the field, I've been putting together events. Like when I was in New York with the Dustin Bahagan group, putting together events like every week. So it's kind of a continuation of that, just kind of like started this basically when I left New York and moved. And I just keep doing, instead of having, events in New York with lectures, I have people that I get to talk to one-on-one, and it's also continues my education in that way and keeps me connected to community because I'm out here like all by myself with zero community. So it does provide a lot of great things in that way, but it also does take up probably like 5-6 hours a week, and that's kind of a lot. It's not
Yeah.
nothing.
Yeah.
I do everything by myself, and I book all the interviews and find all the people and do all the interviews and do all the editing of video and audio and everything else. So it is kind of time consuming. I spend evenings of my weekday doing this, instead of like hanging out with my dog or my husband or doing basically anything else.
Yes.
This is
Yeah.
what I do.
Yes. And that's what I mean by labor. And I think there's something about just being honest with that and folks knowing, like, I think we called it, like how the sausage is made,
Yeah,
because
this is the how the sausage is made episode.
exactly. And I just want to name also, it might feel like you're betraying something in you by saying, this actually does take time and this does take labor. But I think there's something deeply disalienating, to use Fanon's word, about like recognizing that the things that we do and love and bring into this world do constitute labor. There's something very disruptive to me and like unsettling when we disavow that, right? And we disavow that on the one hand, but then also there's a lot of joy and pleasure that you're bringing into the space. So I think there's a way for us to say, yeah, this takes a lot of time, and like, I still love it, right? But to also name it. But I'm just like thinking, this is 5 years into your show and you're making a How the Sausage is Made episode.
Yeah.
5 years into your show, which is
5.5 years.
Right?
Yeah, totally. No, and I do love it, but yeah, I do get tired sometimes, especially because I don't see a lot of feedback. And even though the Patreon community is great, there's like 60 people there, but that's what also precipitated it. I won't name the podcast, but there's like a much newer psychoanalytic podcast that maybe started like a few months ago, and they have like hundreds of people on their Patreon. And that's what sent me into my existential crisis when I saw they had like several hundred people in their Patreon. But it's because they only offer content exclusively through the Patreon. So you have to subscribe to be able to hear the podcast. And that's
Right.
not something that is in my values. Like that's fine for other people to do, but for me, I really made this show for everybody. And I want everybody to be able to listen to these conversations, no matter what. But it would be nice to just get the support without having to do something like that. And I also was telling you, I hate having to think like, oh, do I need to market it better? And like, should I put
Yeah.
part of an episode and then the other rest of the episode on the Patreon or whatever? And I just can't, I don't want to think like that. I hate that way that the system makes you think like that. Like, how do I market myself? It's like, I'm a psychoanalyst. I don't want to have to think about how to market myself. I just want to like listen and help and like do the psychoanalytic work.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, and that's the grind, the degrading part of capitalism. Like, here you are, basically, like, this was not the plan, was to make this accessible to everybody. And then you feel backed into a corner to have to like compromise yourself and do these things that don't feel aligned or good to you because of the way the world is structured, that this is part of your, stream of to live, right? And you've like done a lot of work to try and not be backed into that corner. So I think there's something really important about putting out a community call and saying like, there's a lot of people that listen to this. I know there's value in this, and I know a lot of people value it. And so what is it like also for us to be vulnerable and like practice our values of, I would say, like, for me, what I learned from Black feminist care or abolition work, and say, this is the type of care we need to have a space like this be accessible to everybody. And there's no shame in that. I think there's the individualistic sort of process is what creates the shame around, like, I should be able to do all of this by myself, or there's shame in sort of coming to the community and saying, if this is something we all value to have accessible, is there a way we can distribute responsibility to have this happen, or like all pitch in, right? Like a community garden, everybody eats from it, right? But if there was one person doing all the stuff, those vegetables and plants are going to wilt pretty quickly.
Yeah, and that person's going to pass out from heat stroke.
Climate catastrophes on your mind too.
Always. How can it not be? Oh my gosh, it's like been torrential raining here, and it's like 50 degrees and it's August. It's like, what is going on? Yeah,
Right.
I mean, that's what's going on, but.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, how does it feel like for you to put words to this?
It's a little uncomfortable, I must say, but it's good because it's with you.
Yeah.
Lara makes everything better. And I probably said this on some previous episode that we talked about, but I just have to reiterate it. I was seriously about to quit psychoanalysis until I had you on my podcast, because I moved to Sweden. I had a really nice practice in New York and a very like robust community where we were like doing a lot of events, like I said. So it was like very nice to have that kind of collegial community there. And I just assumed that I would move to Stockholm and start up a practice in a similar fashion and have an office and, find the psychoanalytic community there, even though I knew it would be smaller. But it really is kind of non-existent. I mean, it exists, but it's like only the institute, and there's none of the rest of it. So it's like there's no like alternative to the institute in Sweden. I think there's like 3 people that study Lacan in a different city. It's like 3 or 4 hours away. And that's about
worst
it.
nightmare to just rely on the institute.
Yeah, there's like really only the institute, and that's the institute we met in. So maybe that's kind of an interesting sync as well. Like, oh, I went to that institute for a conference, but then I met Lara. So that's good. That came out of it. So that was very good. But yeah, it's not communal here. There's not a big community, and the community that is here is not for me. And I had given a talk there. The day before we had our first podcast scheduled, and I came home like crying basically because it was like so brutal. They just like really were not having what I'm doing there. And then I talked to you, and I was listening to you, and I was like, this is it. This is it. This is it. This is like the future of psychoanalysis. And it was such a breath of fresh air. So thank you.
Oh my gosh, you're the sweet. I mean, it's so funny because I remember that conversation, and I remember like being in the quote unquote green room before the podcast, and we were having that conversation, and you were telling me how brutal they were. And I was just like, fuck that. Like, there's no excuse for people to act like that, period. There will never be a world in which I understand why people are so violent and aggressive and non-hospitable to each other. It's just, and I think I said something along those lines, but I actually didn't know the rest. Like, you didn't tell me that part of like this, that you were going to leave. And I think this was, and when we were discussing the existential crisis you're talking about, you actually mentioned that to me. Like, it was the first time that I heard, which is, it's very, you were just feeling uncomfortable, and now I'm feeling uncomfortable to be like, okay, that's what it, but so what I'm going to do with it is something that makes me be able to hold the love you're giving me, and also relieve myself of like the awkwardness of accepting that fully, and just say like, that is the act of being together and really opening ourselves to being real and loving with each other. Because I think what I remember about that podcast more than the content was like that we were there together, and you created a space where I could be me, right? Where I could probably say fuck a couple times and not worry
As
that
many
you were
times
gonna
as
be
you
like,
want.
oh my
I'll
God,
say
you
it with you. Fuck.
know? Right? And that's what I remember, right? So there's something very real about saying, hey, I got you. And that, the way that I'm gonna relate to you is the way that I want to move through the world. And it's part of the world that I hope we get to live in together, because apparently there are people out there that don't have the same fucking idea about like, you don't need to be an asshole.
Yeah, I think, and even just talking about that, I think that's where some of the feelings come from that make me upset, is because I have historically not found psychoanalytic community to be very supportive of each other. There's individuals that have been very supportive, but as a whole, the field has not been welcoming, has not been supportive. It just feels like very cutthroat, and it makes no sense to me as far as the theoretical standpoint for what psychoanalysis is about. So it's kind of bewildering how analysts that are supposed to be analyzed and like know their shit like continue to enact these dynamics, and then but clearly they do, and there's so much pushback when you even point it out to them, and so it's like I'm trying to hopefully be one person that's part of a community that's creating something different.
Yes.
And I want it to be different in all ways, and I want it to be people to be supportive of each other, including for people to be supportive of me.
Yes, exactly. You have to be a part of that equation, but I think you're spot on, because there's this way in which we're reared with this idea of scarcity. And I can't tell you the number of times folks might reach out to me. I think you might have this experience too. People reach out to me and then are surprised that I like respond to them, or that I like just send a paper to them or hook them up with somebody else that might. And for me, this is like truly like, why would I be hoarding first of all, things that aren't mine to hoard, right? And like the whatever access I might have is because somebody else was generous to me. And so I take that commitment really to heart, of like, everything that was opened up for me by the generosity of somebody else, I am committed to doing that tenfold with whatever little space has been created for me. I will do that. But it's also a commitment to like, I just don't believe in this myth of scarcity in the way that capitalism and professionalism sets up for us. Capitalism creates scarcity, right? Because I don't want to be misunderstood as saying that everybody has the same sort of access. No, of course, I understand that people have different modes of access, but that's because structures created that, not because fundamentally there is a lack of resources, right? And we've said this before, if there are billionaires in the world, that means there are plenty of resources to go around. They're just being hoarded. And so this idea of sharing space and sharing resources and like being like, yeah, of course, come on in, the more the merrier. Like, why would I just want to sit in a space alone and like narcissistically look in a mirror? Like, how fulfilling is that, right? On a most fundamental basis. And I'm kind of like making it light, but really, if you think about it, but that's also the reason why I really, that kind of ties into this episode, is saying like, this is part of that work, is moving against scarcity, is moving against privatization, is moving against hoarding knowledge, is moving against all these modes that are so easy. Like you said, you have a podcast that charges, people will sign up for that. People aren't complaining about that, right? But if you want to move against that grain and say, actually, I don't believe in putting things behind a paywall. I don't want to live in a world where people have to pay to get access to knowledge. And then that's part of your larger political commitment. I think the other side of that political commitment has to also be made known, which is like, we care for each other, right? And that's the whole point.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I hope that I'm making the Patreon more fun, and just making that Discord yesterday. I think that's going to be a really fun way to do it, because clearly Twitter sucks now. Musk definitely ruined it. And then yeah, Instagram and all the meta stuff, they have me like shadow banned or whatever it's called because of my art, because my art sometimes has naked people and I try to cover it, but I guess sometimes I forget because I don't think about it, because to me it's just like not a
It's
thing.
absurd.
Yeah, so I just like post it and then I go, oh crap, I posted someone again that had whatever part. So yeah, it doesn't reach many people, but I miss the kind of golden days of social media where we're all chatting and having a good time on Twitter. So I hope maybe the Discord might help.
Yes. Yeah. And so now I have to like out myself as not knowing how to use Discord.
I never used it till
Figure it out.
yesterday. It's kind of like an old school chat room from like the early days of the internet, where it's just basically, yeah, just like basically a chat room server. And
Okay.
you just add people. So we just sent everybody the link who joins the Patreon, and then you can like make different rooms for different topics. So there's like a topic for books, and people are talking about what different books they're reading and different events that are coming up and things, and then just a general discussion. It's just basically a chat room. Everybody could just chat with each other.
Yeah. That does sound a lot.
Super simple, which
Yeah.
is good because I thought about doing it like a year ago, but I was like, I can't add another thing to do. Like I have enough things to do. I can't like try to learn another thing. But since Twitter's been so terrible and I'm not really using it anymore, then I thought maybe I'll try this Discord thing. And yeah, it just reminds me of like the old chat rooms from like the late 90s, early 2000s, basically, when the internet was not just a corporate hellscape.
Right. Actually, the exact same thing I have, like the last thing I want is one more app I have to deal with. And, one of the things that happened with this smear campaign and sort of threats against me is one of the first things I did was shut down my Twitter because I was getting so much hate and threats through there. And I was just like, I just need to go on lockdown. And like, I don't need one more, they found my address, they found my email addresses, I was like, imagine me creating one more surface area for people to threaten my life and, bombard me, right? In ways that I can't, you can only control that so much. And then you end up, this is the sort of process of social media and apps too. It's like it conscripts you into like going in there and like feeling like you have to be on there to keep track of like it has this perverse way of like, if I'm on there I can keep track of what's happening so then I can keep myself safe. And that was the easiest. I was just like, all of this got to be gone. Like, I don't need one more surface area. The people that I love and that will come with me and know how to be in contact with me. And it was the best decision I made, which opens up psychic and emotional space for me to like, okay, now you say Discord. And I'm like, okay, being in a place with people that I enjoy talking to, and I will do this with you, right? It also, there's just much more intentionality around who I'm interacting with and how I'm interacting and why I want to interact. And is there a political alignment for me at every turn, right? And clearly that was lost for me in the Twitter sphere.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like Molly's there and Chaim's there and Avi's there, Leilani, people that support the podcast. So it's good. And that's the other thing I should mention too, because when they go to the podcast and they'll say, oh, there's 60 people here, but like only like 10%, 15% are from the podcast. Most of the people are fans of Carl's, fans of my husband's. And that's why we do like the Magic Monday stuff, talk about magic and creative practices, because that's what those people want. But that's the other thing I've been struggling with is like people that listen to the podcast might be listening to it mostly for psychoanalysis. Maybe they're not so interested in art or magic, so maybe they don't feel drawn to it. So I want to make sure there's a space for people that are interested in psychoanalysis to kind of talk there too.
Right.
Because they might not be interested in like the art and the other stuff.
Right. And actually that's because I don't think I even knew that early on, that the podcast was part of the same, process or like under the same umbrella as the other stuff you're talking about. So even just saying, hey, this is where Rendering Unconscious lives, and this is what the podcast channel is, and here's what's available when you do that.
Well, and
probably.
that's because also Carl already had like the SoundCloud and the stream and everything set up, and it used to be for his music for his record label, and I co-opted it and put my podcast on it. That's what happened. So I just kind of took over all of Carl's stuff, and then I realized, wait, was Carl's, so maybe we need to share it.
So it's actually communal in its genesis.
It is, exactly. And Carl's so sweet. He
Not
just
hoarding.
let me just take over everything. But I needed that lifeline at the time. Like I think I told you before, I started the podcast when I was in between countries. Like I had left New York, but I wasn't allowed to move to Sweden yet. I was kind of in this in-between space. It was really like a lifeline for me to be able to keep community and talk to people and stay involved in the field and that sort of thing.
Yeah. I think it would be easy to miss that, right? Because we live in a world that's saturated with podcasts, and like, I think it's easy to miss the relationality behind how it got created, why you created it, what it actually did for you, and what it's continuing to do for so many of us in the field. Like that can easily be missed, maybe as a product of this, capitalist world that we live in, where like things are just products. They don't have anybody behind them. They don't have somebody doing the labor to make them be.
Yeah, and I don't want to like brand myself. I just can't with this. I don't want to brand myself so that people consume
I
my
respect
content.
that.
You know what I mean? I just like, I can't.
I respect that. I mean, you're an artist. Like it feels, there's a part of that that feels counterintuitive.
Yeah, no, I just can't. I can't with any of it. I mean, if I had my way, I wouldn't even be using computers or anything, but clearly that you have to do for survival. I would be just here in the forest, like, yeah, in the garden with the dog doing little spells and things. If it had my way, but this is good. It's nice that we can connect this way, of course.
Yes, exactly. And I love you, and I'm so grateful to you for doing this. It means so much to me, and it's like a high point in my world when, obviously I see folks on your podcast who I love are in my world, but I love listening to them. And I love seeing what gets created, what emerges in the space with you. And then there are other people who I haven't met and who I find their work are super, super cool. And I might not have an opportunity to listen to them talk in such a non-restricted way too.
Yeah, that's the goal. Because I've been on lots of podcasts where they like clearly prepare all the questions ahead of time. And yeah, to me, I'd rather just like go with the flow and see what the associations brings. That's what we do, So
Yes.
it's an example of kind of psychoanalytic thought in action.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
In the
Yes.
process and creating a space where there's no expectation or judgment.
Right. Or discipline.
No, it's just free. Say whatever comes to mind.
And where in the world are you going to get a free psychoanalysis?
Totally. No, I love it. And whenever I get frustrated or yeah, in my existential dread, I'll just go and look at some listserv postings from the listservs that we're all on, and then I'll be like, no, this is a really good, important space, actually. And then you can say whatever you want here, and nobody's gonna like, yeah,
yes,
come down with the same arguments that everybody keeps throwing at each other on these listservs and stuff.
yes, yeah.
We're not having that here.
No, but I think there's something also to be said about running into these walls. Like every time I run into a wall, I'm going to sort of borrow here from Arundhati Roy and then also from Feluke Taylor. And she came to my class and she was both of them talk about portals. And like every time I run into a wall, there's this way in which I want to imagine that there's a portal that wall can transform into a portal. And Stephen's actually writing something right now about these portals that are also barricades, right? And I'm not trying to be flowery. It's true. There are limitations to what psychically and emotionally we can take when because some of the stuff on these listservs that you're talking about are just violent they're violent, and there's no other way to describe it. And so running into these walls where we're just like, why am I even here? What's the point? What am I doing? Is actually a really important like reconnection to our humanity. That what I always say to my students is like, don't let people strip you of your humanity. Your ability to run into that wall and then imagine the portal that it can become is part of the fact that you still hold on dearly to your humanity. If I stop doing that, running into a wall and then reimagining the portal it can become, I will be worried about myself and about you if you don't send me those messages being like, what the fuck am I doing here? Because that's like,
What
that
is
means,
wrong with our field?
exactly, that means we're actually alienated from the pulse, both of like the suffering of what's happening in the world, but also like the larger world. Like, how do we not feel demoralized when we look around? When I think about what's happening in Hawaii right now, or when you look at Sudan or Yemen, or, you know,
Palestine.
Palestine, or, you know, pretty much everywhere we're looking, right? Or like, you know, missing Indigenous women in the state now known as Canada, or like, how do you not run into a wall?
No, absolutely. If everywhere seems to either have like a far right wing government or
Yeah,
war or etc.
exactly.
Climate crises
Exactly.
or
So
all of the above.
you are one of our portals, my
You are
friend.
one of our portals. When you're describing that, it's like that's where I was. I had hit that wall. And then I talked to you and it was just like opened up. It's like, oh, there is a way. There is a way forward.
Let's keep creating together, and sort of just an invitation to folks, even from me, to say like, what would it mean for us to imagine this space as not just belonging to Vanessa, but for all of us to be creating together and pitching in.
Yeah. And people often get surprised too when they do write me and they're like, oh, I love the podcast. A lot of times, if they're interested in psychoanalysis, I invite them to come on and talk about it. And a lot of times people are like, oh, but I don't have a book out, or I'm just a student or whatever. And it's like, so what? Like everybody has a point of view. Everybody has something to say and something to contribute at all levels of experience. So, yeah, you're welcome.
I love that.
Good. Should we stop there?
Yes.
Okay, great.